First of all, let me offer a big thank you to the Minister of Health for this tremendous opportunity to talk about newborn screening in the EU and, of course, particularly in Slovenia. And thanks also go to Dr. Tadej Basilino for his encouragement and hospitality and for helping to host this exciting event. We're going to hear particularly from Italy. We'll also hear from France, from Slovenia, from Germany, from Sweden, from the Czech Republic, and from Southeastern Europe. It promises to be an exciting morning, and perhaps most importantly, a morning from which we can learn from one another. But before we do that, I'm going to give a brief overview of the current state and future of newborn screening in the EU on behalf of the ISNS. The ISNS is the International Society for Neonatal Screening, and I have the great privilege to be president of that organization, with members in over 80 countries right around the world, including, of course, Europe. So we've got much to share together and much to celebrate. It's now around 50 years since Robert Guthrie first described a test to detect phenylketonuria, a condition which, if not recognized early, leads to severe developmental delay and very often long-term institutional care for those who are affected. If, on the other hand, it is detected early and asymptomatically by newborn screening, these children can have a normal outcome. And that was absolutely revolutionary. And we've got to thank Robert Guthrie for that, particularly for the test, which could identify phenylketonuria, who was a microbiologist and described a microbiological assay that we no longer use. But he also described a means of collecting the sample onto a dry blood spot card, so that could be sent easily to a testing laboratory, and that we do still use, and that was a singular achievement upon his part. Since then, worldwide, we've probably detected around 100,000 children with PKU who have benefited enormously from that life-changing intervention. And of course, excited by that, doctors around the world saw the success of screening for phenylketonuria and considered if there were other conditions which could also be included. And next on the list was a much more common condition, 6 times as common as phenylketonuria, the condition congenital hypothyroidism. And that too could be radically changed in terms of outcome for the children affected by this simple treatment with thyroxine, provided they were identified early. And these introductions led many around the world to describe the process of newborn screening as one of the major public health advances of the 20th century. So is it all good news? Well, largely it is, and newborn screening has been a hugely significant advance. But nevertheless, we do need to be careful. We need to be careful because, of course, the patients and families at the time that they're being tested believe that their child is well. They're asymptomatic, they've got a new baby, it's the first week of life, they're excited with the arrival of the new baby that looks absolutely perfect. So anything that comes along to upset that, and particularly if it were, for instance, a false positive result, would be a matter of great concern for the family. And that's why Muir Gray, a former director of newborn screening in the UK, coined these important words in an article in the British Medical Journal. He said that all screening programs do harm, some do good as well, and of these, some do more good than harm. And if I were to complete that, it would be at reasonable cost. And what that tells us is, as with most of medicine, is that screening is a balance. It's a balance between doing the good that we seek to achieve, but nevertheless minimizing any side effects that occur as a result. What it does tell us is that more screening for more conditions, does not automatically mean better screening. It can be a gateway into life-changing benefits, but if it's not done properly, it can also lead to problems for families. So what we keep saying within ISNS, the organization that I represent, is that screening which is well organized and delivered as a carefully monitored program linked to structured treatment is what we should aspire to. So with that kind of caveat right at the outset, because that frames really the agenda for today, to try and develop that well-organized screening to deliver it for as many conditions as are appropriate, then we can kind of launch off and make that discussion together. It was against that background of having to consider carefully the use of screening that in the 1990s, David Millington and Don Chase in the US developed a technique called tandem mass spectrometry, and that really was a game changer. This MSMS, as it's described, allowed the recognition simultaneously of up to 40 conditions from a single test. Prior to that, every time a new test was introduced for newborn screening, a new condition was introduced for newborn screening, it required a new test. But now suddenly we were able to detect 40 conditions from a single test. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the member states in the EU have reacted quite differently to that. Some of that have exploited that to a great extent and identified for many conditions. Others have been rather more conservative and still only screen for relatively few. And that variation in practice is not just about the conditions chosen to screen, but also the way in which the screening process, the screening program is led, delivered and conducted. So what do we find when we look at that, when we look at newborn screening today in Europe? On the back of EU Council recommendations in 2009 on rare diseases, the ISNS and others responded to a tender invitation to do a survey. And that survey was conducted in 2010 and showed a great degree of variation, both in practice and in the number of conditions screened. There were some recommendations made back to the European Commission on the basis of that survey. And then the survey has recently been repeated some 11 years later. Gerard Leber, whose name appears on the slide there, was instrumental in arranging that first survey and has diligently kept that up to date. And that was published in the International Journal of Neonatal Screening earlier this year. And what it shows is, while there has certainly been progress across the EU, and that's a great thing to celebrate, there is still considerable variation in practice. So for instance, in our member states, the number of conditions screened varies from 2 in some member states to 35 conditions. And that really is quite a marked difference. But it's not just about the number of conditions that are screened, it's the way that we do that screening. So the date of sampling, the date when the sample is taken, which is pretty crucial in the newborn screening process, varies from 24 hours to 120 hours. The time that it takes for a sample to be transported and analyzed varies from a couple of days up to a month. Whether or not screening is optional or compulsory for our population varies, and you can see the figures there. And a pretty basic thing, such as whether or not our families are informed of the outcome of screening, varies. And they are in only 25% of countries, but are not in 75% of our countries. And that, again, would be a cause for concern. And then particularly topically today, of course, when people are rightly concerned about privacy and data security, the consent to the storage of the residual sample is asked for, again, probably in only around about 25% of our countries. So quite a degree of variation in practice. Of course, the degree of variation in practice brings with it not just a negative, but also the opportunity to learn from what is best. And that's part of the agenda for today, to explore what's going on across Europe. So how do we seek to resolve this variation in practice across Europe, both in terms of the number of conditions and in the way that things are done? Well, I think probably the first important thing to say is that seeking equity doesn't necessarily mean doing the same thing in every situation. It means doing the appropriate thing in the right way at the right time to achieve a commonality of benefit for the children that we serve. And crucially, of course, when we're thinking about the practice of screening, to ensure that good practice becomes common practice in all of our countries. Why do we need to do that? Well, to some extent, achieving the best possible outcome for our children is self-evident, but particularly at the minute, we stand at the verge of a genetic revolution. Genomics is rapidly providing new opportunities to treat rare disorders, but those treatments are very expensive, and so we need to be careful in the way that they're applied. And genomics is also providing new means of detecting those same conditions, sometimes by screening and sometimes by normal clinical investigation. And what we can easily see, that unless we take stock now and make good practice common practice and work out ways of achieving equity, then we'll see increased divergence as these genetic treatments and diagnostic techniques become applied differently in different member states. Now really is the time to act. So if we're going to act, what strengths do we have? Well, we do have some considerable strengths. I think all of our health systems already recognize that newborn screening is a significant benefit. All are engaged in newborn screening, and that newborn screening already enjoys considerable political support. It also enjoys widespread public support. Decline rates for newborn screening, where it's voluntary, are less than 1 in 1,000. And that's a marked contrast, perhaps, to the wariness about vaccines that we see in some of our member states. To help guide decision-making, all policymakers recognize these Wilson and Yugner criteria are important when making decisions about which disorders to choose. Wilson and Yugner first coined these straightforward and simple to understand criteria back in 1968, right at the time that screening was beginning to emerge in terms of newborn screening. And they're really self-evident. Things like the condition should be important, there should be an accepted treatment, there should be a test which is acceptable to the population, and that we understand the natural history of the condition. And of course, crucially, there's an agreement upon who to treat and how to treat and when to treat. So many of these criteria are widely shared. So given that we all recognize the importance of newborn screening, and given that we share criteria to make choices, why do we see such difference from one member state to another? Firstly, it probably rests upon the level of evidence required. Some countries require published peer-reviewed evidence of benefit before accepting a condition into the national screening program. Others, on the other hand, will accept simply the recommendations of senior clinicians within their country that this would be of benefit without necessarily having published evidence to that effect. Some administrations require cost-effectiveness studies and the demonstration of a cost per quality adjusted life year that is better than the threshold set. And others don't apply that restriction before conditions are included. Perhaps most crucially, the makeup of the decision bodies themselves varies. Where they are dominated by professionals from a public health background, they tend to be rather more conservative. Whereas when the doctors faced with seeing these patients who have not been screened and detected early predominate in the decision-making group, then as one could imagine, there's a tendency to want to include new conditions within that list. And of course, finally, the level of direct political involvement. If politicians, we've said that it's a popular political thing to engage in newborn screening, and where politicians, influential politicians get involved, then we often see conditions being included, particularly at their encouragement. So how can we, against that background, how can we progress? Well, I think firstly, we've got to recognize that we really do owe this to the next generation, not only to do screening when it's appropriate, but to do it well. We can raise awareness, and this year, 2021, marks the first of International Neonatal Screening Day, which is on June the 28th and be celebrated again next year. And that day was chosen to celebrate the birthday of Robert Guthrie that we mentioned earlier. We need to develop trusted information sources that can be trusted not just by health professionals and the public, but also by health policymakers. That is something which is free from bias and certainly free from lobbying, which really deals with evidence. And that's what we've been trying to do within screen for rare. We need to learn to share information in a systematic way. Many of our member states already have done pilot schemes for particular conditions. For instance, severe combined immune deficiency has had a pilot scheme in France, it's had a pilot scheme in Germany, it's had a pilot scheme in the Netherlands, and we're now starting a pilot scheme in the UK. But very often, the outcomes from those are not shared in a systematic way. So then we must repeat that time after time. And of course, it would be good to think that we could design, if you like, a template for pilot schemes, which would allow information to be shared. Crucially, we need to have shared case definitions for the conditions that we identify, seemingly obvious, but not always in place. And we need to look at long-term outcome studies so that we can really measure and analyze the benefits of screening and learn from that experience to improve it. And we need to work with and alongside health policymakers to inform without challenging important national autonomy, which must be preserved. We must encourage by the provision of information. And to help that, it would be enormously useful to develop a newborn screening expert group, which was recognized by the European Commission as a source for unbiased, evidence-based advice. And that is one of the deliverables that we would really long to see coming out of this meeting today. So where are we now and what next steps might we take? We've already formed, with EC support, an EU health policy platform to house some of that reliable information which we've discussed. We formed a European reference network screening group. Of course, the European reference network's key to the rare diseases policy within the EU, and they have a great interest in newborn screening because, of course, if patients are identified early and asymptomatically, the outcomes are usually much better. This is the second in a series of high-level meetings that we hope to use to raise awareness of some of these important issues. The first was a meeting of the European Reference Network Screening Group just over a month ago, back in September. And of course, there is this important meeting now hosted by the Slovenian Presidency. And then we have a special event at the ISNS European Symposium just 1 month from now, moving towards newborn screening as a system is the title for that. And we hope these will be milestones in trying to build awareness and build a strategy. We've got some international exposure for the exciting work that we're doing in Europe, and the American Public Health Laboratory meeting on the 6th of October is receiving a presentation about just this, about the work that we're engaged in today. We need to chart a way forward, and we need to chart that way forward together by learning from one another, and that's one of the goals of this meeting. Thank you very much for listening. And now, as I promised, against that general background, we're going to hear some of the good things that are going on in our member states. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Giancarlo Lamarca from Italy to tell us the good things that have been going on in Italy and what we might learn together from that. Thank you.